Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our final Sage Votes program of the semester, What's Left After They Take Your Vote. I am Jeff Miller. I'm the Director of Corporate, Government, and Foundation Relations and a committee member on the Sage Votes Committee. Sage Votes is a comprehensive, nonpartisan initiative whose mission is to promote student voter registration, voter participation, and voter awareness throughout on-campus and virtual activities. Our committee consists of students, faculty, and staff. We are also excited to partner on tonight's event with the Advocacy Subcommittee of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for tonight's program on the current state of voter suppression efforts here in the United States. So in a backlash to 2020's historic voter turnout and under the pretenses of responding to baseless and racist allegations of voter fraud and election irregularities, state lawmakers have introduced a startling number of bills to suppress the vote. Legislators have introduced hundreds of bills with restrictive provisions in 47 states. The most restrictive bills take aim at absentee voting, while other bills seek stricter voter ID requirements. State lawmakers also aim to make voter registration harder, expand voter roll purge, and adopt flawed practices that would risk improper purges and cut back on early voting. The states that have seen the largest number of restrictive bills are introduced are Texas, Georgia, and Arizona. This suppression impacts the student voters. But as we saw from the 2020 election, the student vote was unprecedented. Over half of all voters under the age of 30 voted in the 2020 election, a record figure according to data from the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University. That is why tonight we have assembled a panel of young leaders who continue to fight for your voters' rights. Please enter any questions along the way in the chat, and we'll make sure we can pose them at our time at the end. Moderating tonight's conversation is Jeff Mayo. Jeff is a civil rights attorney for people with mental illness and developmental disabilities. He has been a longtime housing and homeless advocate in Albany, with stints at the Homeless Action Committee, United Tenants of Albany, and Joseph's House and Shelter. Jeff is currently the endorsed candidate of the Democratic Party for Albany Common Council, Ward 6, and has served as a committee person on the Albany County Democratic Committee for over a decade. Jeff received his bachelor's in arts in history summa cum laude from the University of Albany in 2007, and received his JD from the University of Michigan Law in 2012, where he received national and school-wide awards for his social justice advocacy on behalf of vulnerable individuals. So we are so happy to have Jeff here tonight to lead this really awesome conversation. And I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. I know it gets a little confusing when there are multiple Jeffs involved in anything, but we'll do the best we can. We have some great panelists tonight. I'm really excited to introduce them. First, we have Sonia Frederick. Sonia serves as the first ward council member on the City of Albany Common Council. She was appointed to this position in January of 2020 and recently won election later that year. Sonia is the youngest member to ever serve on the council and the first Latina member of the Albany Common Council. In addition, she works as a government consultant at KPMG. Sonia received her bachelor's degree from UAlbany in accounting and finance and is currently pursuing her CPA certification. Next, we have Natalia Lektakia, who is a speech language pathologist who has dedicated her career to working in public education. She has been passionate about politics since she was a child and has worked on many local campaigns. She was elected to the Saratoga Springs City School District Board of Education in 2019 in a highly politicized race where she was outspent 30-1. If I recall correctly, a lot of that centered around the issue of having armed police officers in the schools in Saratoga, right?
Actually, armed non-police officers.
Wow.
So armed grounds monitors.
And a lot of that funding came from outside groups who wanted that.
The funding came from inside groups, but it did go to like Florida to run the election. It was really an interesting school board race.
Wow. So that's unusual. So Natalia has some great experience. She's also co-chair of the Capital District Democratic Socialists of America Electoral Committee. In her spare time, Natalia loves to spend time with her husband, 5-year-old, and parrots, sing and ride her bicycle. Last but not least, we have Nick Rangel. Nick is an assistant deputy counsel to the New York State Senate Majority Democratic Conference in counsel's office. She serves on the Albany County Democratic Committee and the Colony Democratic Committee. Nick volunteers on the legal team on the New York State Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, handling petition reviews, ballot counting, and election recounts. Nick contributes to the legal profession through her pro bono legal services with the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York Closing the Gap program. I believe that's where Nick and I met probably about 9 or 10 years ago, was it Lasney? Nick also serves on the Committee on Character and Fitness for the 3rd Judicial District of New York. Nick is a member of the Capital District Black and Hispanic Bar Association, the New York State Bar Association, and the Hispanic National Bar Association. She also leads the Capital District National Lawyers Guild chapter. So now that we've all met our guests, we can jump in. I just want to give a short presentation on what is called HR 1 or For the People Act, which is a federal voting rights bill, which recently passed in the House but is stalled in the Senate. It was introduced in response to a number of state level Republican-led voter suppression efforts, which Jeff Miller just outlined. Some of the proposed components of the bill include an automatic voter registration system with an opt-out system instead of what we currently have as an opt-in system. Guaranteed same-day voter registration during early voting and election day. At least 15 days of early voting for federal elections. Nonpartisan redistricting committees comprised of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents in each state. This would be an effort to prevent partisan gerrymandering, and that's a practice which the Supreme Court of the United States has declined to really rule on, finding that it's not a question of law, it's more a question of politics. And there are also some campaign finance changes, and one of my favorite components, the requirement that both presidential and vice presidential candidates return or disclose their tax returns for the previous 10 years. I wonder why they included that. So with that said, I will now turn it over to our wonderful presenters. Thank you.
Great. So just want to make sure folks can see the screen. So many of the proposals that are in the federal legislation are bills that we've been able to pass since taking the majority in the last few years at the state level. We've been modernizing voter registration so that people can register online. We did just recently adopt automatic voter registration, which will effectively enroll an eligible voter unless they opt out. We've adopted universal transfer law, where if a voter moves within the state, their registration goes with them. They would still have to update their address at the polls, but they would be able to vote if they had been registered. And we also recently authorized 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register even before they're eligible to vote, and not changing the age of voting, but allowing them to be registered ahead of time, which we think is a really great civics lesson that can be taught in schools statewide. We're really excited about that. And this is not new, but I just do want to note that college students can register to vote at either their parents' or their pre-college address or where they attend college. You can vote at either voting district. and you can choose where you want to register. I always like to include that for college students, because so many people think they have to go home to vote, and that's just not the case. We also enacted early voting. There are now 9 days of early voting ahead of Election Day. There has to be at least one voting site per 50,000 voters, and the municipality with the highest population of voters has to have a voting location. And this was a more recent move because of a situation in Rensselaer, and folks may be aware of this, but there were no early voting sites in the city of Troy in Rensselaer when early voting started. So that should alleviate some of that challenge, that barrier to voting. And by law, early voting hours have to include a combination of weekend, weekday, and evening hours in order to accommodate people's various types of schedules. We also authorize voters' request to absentee ballots earlier in the process. There was an executive order, but then a new legislation authorizing voters to request an absentee ballot due to risk of illness, including COVID. We also allowed ballots to be postmarked on the day of the election, November 3rd this year, essentially allowing a ballot that's postmarked by the date of election to be counted as long as it's received by the BOE within 10 days. We also authorized drop boxes and are hopeful that we'll be able to expand that program. We've also recently enacted legislation that would ensure voters that they have more time to get their absentee ballots back to the BOE. Oops, sorry. Other recent changes include a right to cure. So if your ballot has a deficiency, like it didn't have the date when you signed your ballot, the BOE has to let you know that there's a deficiency and give you an opportunity to cure it. You would also have a notice of a ballot challenge. Ballot challenges occur when counsel for either candidate find the deficiencies in your ballot, and this would let you know that your ballot's been challenged, and if it's within the right to cure window, give you an opportunity to fix it. We also enacted ballot tracking, so you can track your ballot statewide. New York City also has their own tracking system, so you can see when it's been mailed out after you've requested an absentee ballot, and you can also see when it's been received. And then we have a couple of constitutional amendments in the pipeline. A constitutional amendment has to pass 2 separate legislatures. The legislature runs on a 2-year cycle, so that means it has to pass in 1 year of one cycle, and then in another year of a new seated legislature. So in this case, 2019 and then 2021, this would create no excuse absentee voting by mail. So you would not have to say, the reason I need to vote by absentee ballot is because I'm going to be out of town, or I'm caring for a loved one. You would be able to just say, I just want to vote by absentee. And same day registration would allow a person to register on election day. These pieces would be critical because we don't have this at the federal level, and this would require us to change the state's constitution. Assuming these both pass the assembly, then they would be on your ballots this next year as for voter referendum. So be on the lookout for some, fun ballot activity this year. Yay, voting. And then just quickly, if you are ever at a polling location for any reason and you are being told you can't vote, whether it's because, and these are real excuses I've heard being given to voters, everything from, well, you voted absentee, so you can't vote in person, which is false. You can vote in person no matter what, or they can't find you in the book, or you don't have ID. You do not need to have ID to vote. If a person can't find you in the voting book because they can't figure out how to spell your name and you don't have ID with you to help, you can still vote. You can demand a provisional or affidavit ballot. And actually, you can always demand an affidavit ballot. There is no reason to not to get an affidavit ballot in the state of New York. And so if you're ever at a polling location and you're being denied a ballot for any reason, here are some contacts for folks that can help out. You can call the Attorney General Election Hotline. You can call your county board of elections on election day and on primary day. There is pretty much always somebody available to take board of election calls. There are also a number of voter election protection organizations. This number 866 Our Vote is a national line, and then more locally we have the NYDLC and also the League of Women Voters in New York. And with that, we were going to turn it over to our elected friends so they can talk more about their experience running for office here in New York.
Natalia, would you like me to go first? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Sonia Frederick, a First Ward Common Council member. Nick, thank you for the great presentation, and Jeff for the good intros as well. So last year I had my first election cycle, and I went through the process of just really being entrenched in the ins and outs of what it means to go through a campaign and to have voters and et cetera. So it was definitely a learning experience for me. Some of the key things that Nick pointed out, which are very true, are that even if you submit an absentee ballot, you can absolutely go to the polls that day of election day and vote, and that vote will count. So your absentee will automatically be dismissed, and the vote that you do on election day would count. So that came up a few times during my process last year, and I had a few people question, well, I voted absentee, can I still go to the polls? And I said, absolutely, you can definitely do that. Another thing I think is that I found a good thing is to not dissuade voters was there's a lot of strict policies in place on election day, such as a candidate cannot be at a polling site over X amount of time to dissuade voters from voting for a different candidate. That actually happened to me last year where I was in an election and my opponent was going to certain sites and sitting, and the Board of Election took that very seriously, and they actually had to remove the individual from the facilities whenever that would occur. So there's definitely a lot of policies in place to make sure that you can vote, and you can vote for who you want to, and you shouldn't feel discouraged, threatened, etc. to vote for however you vote. And I'll just say I'm very supportive of no excuse absentee voting. I think that's very critical. For me, my first election was during COVID-19, right? So a lot of people in the first ward ended up voting absentee ballots. And I thought that was very huge for making sure that people would be able to vote without the threat of having to go to the polling site. And even, looking forward past COVID, if you have a conflict that day or you just can't make it to the polls, absentee is a perfect way for you to still vote and still be represented and counted, even though you can't make the official election day. So that's my 2 cents there, and I'll pass over to Natalia.
Thank you. To add on to what Sonia said, there's also restrictions on where you can post signs encouraging people to vote. And I think that that's important. I remember going to vote last fall and driving along a corridor that was lined with signs that were definitely violating that. That said, I wanted to talk a little bit. Oh, one moment, I have a visitor. Sorry. That said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of college student votes on my election, the one that I ran in. So I live in Saratoga Springs, where Skidmore College is located, and there were about 200 to 300 voters in my school board election when there are only 3,500 to 4,000 voters total. That's a big number. And one thing that I talked about with community members who were concerned about college students voting in a place where they don't live was that, first of all, college students do live where they go to college. When you spend the majority of your year in a place, you live there. And the decisions that are made in your community impact you, and you should have a say in that. And aside from that, we, like Jeff mentioned, the big topic that was, being decided by my election was about grounds monitors carrying guns on campus at the high school. College students, much more than almost any other voter who regularly votes in our school board election, know recently what it's like to be a high school student and to be impacted by the decisions that are made in their high schools. To me, that meant that the Skidmore voters had, a somewhat unique outlook that allowed them to make a decision that for a lot of parents or older community members was more hypothetical. For them, it was, this is what actually impacted me last year or 2 years ago. So that said, I think it's important to vote where you feel that the decisions that will be made are the ones that you value the most, which is tough when you're split between two communities. I know I still really heavily care about the politics in my hometown, and it's tough to know that I don't have a say in them, even though I visit. But I certainly encourage all college students to vote where they are.
Thanks, everybody. That was great. I like history, and I especially like local political history. And there is a lot of that in the city of Albany. And just a couple kind of funny anecdotes that I've read about over the years. The Albany County Democratic machine had a lot of different ways of maintaining power and control. And there was a myth that used to go around that if you went into the voting booth and you clicked anyone other than a Democrat, it would make a different sound, and the poll inspectors would know about that. And so there was always that myth that there wasn't actually a secret ballot in the city of Albany, even though there was. It was just a myth. I don't even know where to start with that, but I just wanted to share that. I thought that was something funny that I read not too long ago. There was also an issue, the light bulbs that they had above voting booths back in the day were such that people could see your shadow and which way you were turning in the voting booth. And if you were turning a certain way, it meant that they could tell which line you were voting on. So at some point they had to install light bulbs that were not so fluorescent, I think. And that way your voting could not be monitored from the outside. So anyway, if Jeff Miller is here, I'd like to turn it over to him and see if it's time yet for our Q&A.
It is time for our Q&A. Yes, great segue. I had a couple questions that were prepared. So panelists, what worries you the most about voter suppression, and what message is it sending to our young college voters?
Sorry, Jeff, what was the first part?
What worries you the most about voter suppression? What should our young people be worried about the most as far as voter suppression?
I think that so much of voter suppression has to do with misinformation and a feeling that votes don't matter, or a sense that votes are undercounted or don't weigh as much. And I think that, I talk to people on sort of both ends of the spectrum, like people who on one side think, well, how do elections even impact me on like a day-to-day basis? And then I hear from people who think, sort of the opposite, that like, because your vote is so precious, it can be stolen from you. And so I think on both ends of the spectrum, it really drives people away from voting or from being interested in elections. But I think it's also difficult to find campaigns and find your way into partisan politics in a way. So just for example, I had not been involved in partisan politics for most of my political career. I had not been involved in electoral politics until I really started in the Senate. And then, after the Trump race, the first Trump race, people were encouraging women and people of color to run for office. And you're like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, I think that's a great idea. But once you start getting sort of thinking about it, you realize there's actually a lot of barriers to doing that. It's actually incredibly difficult to enter electoral politics green. And what that means is that if there isn't a pipeline for Black and Brown candidates or women candidates, if you haven't already been connected with people who can help you run a campaign, you're going to face a tremendous uphill battle. And so then how do you galvanize new voters? I mean, you're talking about your candidates like universe of networks who could be brought to the polls in a new way, and aren't, because they just don't necessarily see themselves in the people running. And so I think those are the three top kind of challenges that I see on the ground, and some of the things that, some of the reasons I do work like this, and I do know your rights trainings for Black and Brown voters, is that we just don't see a lot of representation. And when we do, we don't see how it impacts us on the ground. And when we do see it on the ground, we don't see our votes having the impact that they should, to summarize.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that. I'm not 100% sure if I'm the first person of color to be elected to the Saratoga Springs City School District, but I am the first woman of color to be elected. And I think about that every time that I'm at the table, and how for many of my students, this is their first time, or for many of the students in my district, this is their first time having somebody who looks even a little bit like them at the table, and who knows their experiences being a person of color in a majority white community, making the decisions that impact them. And now a board of education is very different from a lot of electoral positions. It is an oversight position rather than, a legislative position. It is different. But still, it's something that I think about a lot, and how a lot of people voted for me because it was their first chance to vote for a woman of color for this position. And like I said, there was a big effort, my election, and actually in the 2020 and 2019 general elections as well, to stop Skidmore students from voting. To the point where in 2019, a group of local conservatives called the police on students for having pizza near the voting area on Skidmore campus. And I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about why so many people want to stop other people from voting. What is it that leads them to say college students shouldn't vote in this election, or voting shouldn't be so accessible under whatever excuse, but really with the reason of trying to stop more people from voting? And I do think that it comes from a position of fear. I think that the world is changing faster than ever, and some people are afraid of that. And I don't personally relate to that. The more people who vote, the happier I am. But it is complicated. And then I agree with Nick that, it is sometimes difficult to look at a ballot and to say, will any of these people, if I vote for them, make a real material difference in my life? And if they won't, how much work am I willing to do to get my vote to count? And for, I think, a lot of voters, they don't see themselves represented. They don't see the potential for change. And the idea of standing in line for 8 hours in order to vote for, one of two options, neither of whom is appealing to them, doesn't feel worth it. And I think that that's complicated too. I think that when we look at voting and the changes that I want to see, I think it comes from who's running as well, but there are so many barriers.
I can jump in as well. I think my biggest fear with voter suppression tactics is not having appropriate parties represented in the election process. And it actually brings me back to a story. I grew up in the Finger Lakes region, and my mother came from Puerto Rico. She's been a citizen for over 35 years at this point. And the last year, again, was my first time having an election. And she told me last year for the general election for president, that was the first time she ever voted for a president. And I was a little shocked by that story. I was like, I started questioning her, like, why have you never voted before? We've always, I grew up, we watched the news, we would talk about certain presidential candidates, we'd see local elections happening. And I didn't know my mother didn't vote. And she told me that she attempted to once, and she was so uncomfortable when she went to the facility. She felt like she wasn't welcomed. She felt like people looked at her funny, like she shouldn't be there. And that made her turn away and never look back. And so it's stories like that that make me think like any form of voter suppression tactics can stop a person from voting for the entirety of their life. And we need those voices represented. So.
As you were sharing that story, Sonia, I read earlier today that, legislation is emboldening people to be poll watchers, and that citizens can raise questions about the authenticity of a ballot. It just seems like these real knee-jerk reactions to the big lie. How do we move past this? How do we get over this and make sure that that these tactics don't become law?
Can I just speak on the poll watcher question?
Sure, please.
I just want to expand on it. So candidates are allowed to have their own poll watchers at polling locations, and you have to have, you're supposed to have basically a permit that says I'm here for so-and-so party or so-and-so candidate. And I think that poll watchers actually serve a really important function, and that poll watchers are trained by the party that they're volunteering for, and they catch a lot of the mistakes that poll workers are engaging in. And I just will say I've been a poll watcher for like a decade for elections at all levels of government. And it doesn't matter how great of a polling location you have, will always be, in some instances, a poll worker who doesn't think somebody is eligible to vote and doesn't tell them that they have a right to an affidavit ballot. So in my opinion, having lots of poll watchers is great. And having poll watchers in polling locations with information like I posted here can really help elevate a problem before a voter is turned away. So I just, I do encourage people to volunteer as poll watchers. You can be a poll watcher for any of these organizations listed here. You can be a poll watcher for your party, your local committee, or a candidate, an individual candidate that you want to volunteer for. In that sense, what I would also encourage people to do, though, is to volunteer as poll workers. Those two roles are different. Poll workers work for the Board of Elections. They are usually, and I don't want to be rude, but they're usually elderly folks who are retired because they can spend, these hours are terrible. Like they start at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, they show up, they're there until 11 p.m. at night, until everything is counted and reported out. And the stipend is terrible. It's like $200 or something, maybe $250. So one thing that would really improve the voting system is to have more people volunteer as poll workers. So if you are a person who's really like, I want voting to be better and easier for people to show up and have questions and have their questions answered. And this new technology coming out where your voter registration's on a tablet, we need younger volunteers and we need volunteers who will do the training and are committed to making sure everyone can vote. So like, I just want to double down, be a poll worker. And if you don't want to be a poll worker, be a poll watcher, but be there to be the eyes on the ground. It's really important.
Thank you for that clarification between poll worker and poll watcher. Is there any conversation around making these positions more attractive? Because as you said, I mean, you start at 5 in the morning and you're obligated to stay there until late into the night. Is there any way to make it more accessible for people?
Well, you could pay them more, but you know, that costs money. So that's hard. And there have been conversations at the state level at raising the stipend. And, you know, as candidates and volunteers in your local party or committee, you can do things like bring them dinner and bring them lunch, which lots of people do, but not enough. So there are things that could make that a less awful day for somebody, but it's just about your passion. And if your passion is voter rights, you're going to do it, even though it's like a really rough day. Because I think there's a challenge in splitting up the day into shifts because of the possibility of the handoff being handled poorly. So there's a real interest in keeping it a full day commitment and keeping people on site and making sure, like, you know, there's no risk of, you know, corruption or something. But there are things that individuals can do to just make it more pleasant, I suppose, too.
Great, thank you. We have a question here in the chat, and I'm assuming this is open to all of our wonderful panelists. Can you tell us more about actual local issues that we college students could impact through our votes? So I'll read that again. Can you tell us more about actual local issues that we as college students could impact through our votes?
So I could speak to what's currently on the agenda for the Common Council or being discussed, and that'll give a good sense of what local issues college students can be involved with and help impact. Right now, Common Council is currently debating police reform. So with everything going on, Governor Cuomo had a call for us to make collaborative and issue a report about police reform we'd like to see in Albany. And right now the council has to take that report that was done mostly by the community and translate that into legislation. So for example, one of the topics that are currently on the calendar is tear gas and whether or not we should ban tear gas or keep it in the city of Albany. Another thing we're currently voting or looking to vote on soon would be good cause eviction. That's related to housing issues here in the city of Albany and whether or not and whether we can, you know, provide more housing options or more housing, less restrictions for tenants here in the city of Albany, and make sure they're able to stay and live in their facilities. Another thing we're also looking to vote on soon is around, I said police reform, I said housing, a lot of stuff about like properties and various rezones for the area and whether or not you'd like to see a certain business happen in an area. So really a lot of change happens at the local level. And I don't think if you're not, you know, immersed in the local level politics, you might not know exactly what changes can be made. But honestly, I think it all comes down to local politics at the end of the day. Like there's some big changes that can be made to the city. And we deal with other things like quality of life issues, including our roads, our infrastructure, and, you know, everything basically on the table. So definitely highly recommend you get involved in local politics and even just reach out to your council representative, try to learn more, come to a council meeting. You know, I think that's where you can start. And if you have any questions, I'm sure all of us council members would be more than happy to have a conversation.
Go ahead, Nick.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think that police reform or the topic of policing is just a major topic in any community right now. And I know that in Saratoga it is too. I know that a lot of Sorry to keep talking about Skidmore, but a lot of Skidmore students have been activated by this topic after many Skidmore students attended a protest last summer and were shot at with rubber bullets. And I'm sorry, that's not the right word. Sorry, pepper bullets by our county sheriff. And so now when I virtually attend our city council meetings, there are many Skidmore students who are activated and participating. And I think that's another thing, is that it is important to vote. That is something that I firmly believe. But I also believe that if you want to see change in your community, or if you want to see things carried out in your community, there is work to be done every day of the year. So attending a council meeting, attending a school board meeting, submitting comments, sharing your ideas, reaching out to your electeds is a great way to start and continue conversations and to share ideas that they might not have considered before. Before I ran for the school board, I thought, how do these people know everything that's going on? I've worked in the public schools since I finished graduate school, and I have no idea what's going on half the time. And that's how they are too. We don't know. People don't know unless you reach out. So I think that it is important to vote. I think it's essential to vote if you're able to. But I also think that having conversations and reaching out and attending matters as well. And I think that having those conversations and I guess showing your electeds that you're a real person who's engaged also makes them less likely to not view you as a person whose voice should be considered as the same as theirs at the ballot box.
And I want to just maybe add a couple of points too. So everything that happens at the local level is also amplified up the levels of government. So at the state level, we're working on police reform, and many of those police reforms are the things that are being pushed at the local level. And one way that major reforms happen is that local governments like Albany's Common Council or New York City's Common Council, like they push and they pressure these legislative agendas up to the state level so that we can do them statewide. It's similar to how the federal government works nationally. If you hit a point where there's a tide change across the country, you get enough states that legalize marriage equity or equality, and you can then start to do that at the national level. So we legalize gay marriage at the local level, that goes up to the state level, eventually it becomes national law. So like that is how your votes start to amplify up the levels. I would just say at the state level, in addition to having police reforms on the agenda and having, for example, we just legalized cannabis. Now that the state law authorized cannabis, local governments are going to have to choose whether to opt out of allowing retail stores or use. Sorry, hold. Sorry. You also have to have an opt-out at the local level. So that's one way that the local activism and local involvement has an impact on individual voters.
Yeah, another example of that is that, oh, I'm sorry, Sonia. Right now, so for my school district in Saratoga Springs, we're talking about the creation of a district-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. This is something that's been recommended by the New York State School Boards Association. It's something that the Board of Regents has also released a draft on. And the pushback that we're seeing directly reflects the conversation that's happening at the national level. In fact, I've gotten messages from people and I thought, where are you getting this idea from? Like, I don't understand. And then I've turned around and I've seen national level politicians sharing the same non-factual information. So much of what I think that all politics is local, even if sometimes what's happening at the national level doesn't feel like it's local, there's almost certainly a local component to it.
Then if I can just share one other thing, this year, well, I'll start by saying, especially as a youth, you can open your local politicians' eyes to things that they might not have seen before. An example of that is this year, a youth group primarily organized of high school students and college students came to the Common Council with information about our city flag and gave us history in the fact that the images portrayed and the colors portrayed have ties to neo-Nazi past. And that's something as a council member I had no clue about until having our youth members come to us and present the information. And then we ultimately put forth legislation to redesign our flag, and that's in process now. So things like that, you might think it's super small, but honestly, it makes huge change and it opens our eyes to things like we might not even see. So absolutely get involved. Your values and your beliefs, they all matter, and we want to make sure that we can represent them appropriately.
That's really awesome, Sonia. Can you talk to us kind of how that process was? How did the students identify this issue? How were they able to bring it to you and make change?
Yep. So in terms of how they found the information, I don't know exactly. They're just brilliant-minded students who have a deep passion for history, and they're able to find things, and but they actually came to an individual council member that was in their area where they lived, and they brought this information. He was fully on board to bring it forward to the full body. So when he put forth that legislation to us to vote on, all the youth members that were part of that group, a majority of them came to speak, and basically that's where I learned, like, oh, this is stemming from amazing people from the high school and the college in the area, and we all were fully supportive of that. I'm pretty sure it passed with like a unanimous vote that night that we were going to move forward with the redesign.
And sometimes those topics are things that council members know about. So here we have a group of sophomore students at the high school who have been going to city council meetings to talk about the need for recycling bins downtown. I don't believe that any person on our city council doesn't know how essential it is to treat our planet well, to recycle, to make recycling accessible to all. And yet it's a bunch of teenagers who are the ones who are showing up to the council meetings to say, no, this needs to happen, and it needs to happen now.
I'll just chime in and say that in my experience in local politics and running for office now, the people who tend to be the most involved in local politics are people who have the time and resources to be able to do it. That tends to be older people, especially older homeowners who feel that they have a real stake in the future of our municipalities because they've invested their time and their money here. And I would encourage any college students, any young people, not to be intimidated. I love hearing from young people. I love getting your perspective. And a lot of times you can, like the other panelists had mentioned, you can bring up issues that we might not have considered, we might not even have been aware of. So really don't be afraid to get involved. I think that most local elected officials would be happy to hear from you and would appreciate your enthusiasm. I know that I would.
That's so awesome. Thank you all. You're making me think of some things of, as we move past COVID, how can we get our students directly involved with these changes? And it sounds like it's happening, and we want to make sure that it's happening for our students here at Russell Sage. So we have a couple more minutes. One of the questions I would love for you all to answer is what advice would you give to our students if they're looking to get involved and looking to be activated? There was an article in Inside Higher Ed that was released today that said that 50% of young people participated in this past election. We need to get them back and vote because we want to create a healthy routine and habit out of voting. What would you say to our students to keep that motivation up and to keep them activated as voters and politically engaged?
I mean, I have a silly idea, which is what we do with my son who came in earlier. Every time that we vote, and we vote in every election possible, including the library votes where about 200 people in my town vote, is as soon as we vote, we go get ice cream. So set up a reward system for yourself. And voting doesn't always feel rewarding, especially if the person that you're voting for didn't win, but ice cream, so rewarding.
I think probably the biggest piece of advice would be get over the fear and understand that there's going to be the nerves involved with getting involved, whether it's voting for the first time or voting in a local election or even participating in local or state level politics or federal politics. There's definitely that fear when you're young, especially that you just don't fit in with whoever's representing or whoever is voting or what have you. And the reality is your voice is needed. And that's something that, I was afraid to vote when I was younger. And here I am today. And that's because I said, you know what, I want to get involved in my community. I want to know my neighbors. I want to know my local politicians. I want to make sure that I can give my opinions and make sure that I hear others' opinions, and doing that process put me here. So there's going to be nerves, obviously, but just say, I want to be a informed citizen. I want to be an active citizen and move forward and push through, because it's so important to have youth members participate in our processes. And, we saw presidential election, we see it everywhere going forward. And ultimately we become the older generation soon, right? So we're going to continue, and this is going to be, now we're young, but we're going to grow older, and we're going to have we're going to have homes or what have you in the neighborhood. So get involved now, because you'll learn the processes, and then later on, you're even that much more active. So go for it.
I'd even make a pitch that as a youthful voter, you are actually a tremendous resource. So, candidates have to do two really primary things. They need people knocking on doors, and they need cash donations. You're a young person, you're in college, you're probably not making a lot of cash donations, but you might have time to knock on doors, and that is a tremendous resource to any candidate on the planet. So find someone who you trust or who you like or who you're interested in, and volunteer for the candidate, volunteer for a party, volunteer for even voter rights, get out the vote organizations that are maybe less partisan, but are still getting people to the polls. Because if you have the time and you've got the interest in learning how to do door-to-door knocking, making phone calls, going to events, people will welcome you into their campaigns, and they'll welcome you into their party work, because they really need volunteers. So it may be maybe a little bit intimidating to walk into a campaign office and be like, I want to volunteer here. But honestly, they're going to just be so grateful for your time. And anyone can do it. So, and they can find a volunteer thing for anyone. So think of yourself as not just an important vote, but also a resource in improving electoral outcomes and voter outcomes.
And those activities are so invaluable for your resume, for your career development. If you can go to somebody's house, knock on their door, and talk to them, you can really talk to anybody.
Yeah, I've been doing door-to-door campaigning for 15 plus years, and I kind of love it. But also, you can do phone campaigning, you can go to events, you can do social media stuff. There's a really wide range of the kind of activities that candidates need help with. If you learn how to fundraise, I mean, that is the icing on the cake. People love fundraisers. If you could be hey, you want this candidate to be in office, it costs money for them to literally pay, print the handouts they need, and you can ask someone to help pay for that. That's such a huge skill, and it's so transferable to like anything. So I encourage you to think about getting involved as a volunteer as also a skill building opportunity that you can transfer into pretty much any field.
Definitely. And Jeff, did you want to mention anything?
I just wanted to say I'm 34 years old, but I've been involved in local politics for almost 20 years. I became involved in a campaign for the local town board when I was 15. I was a freshman in high school, and the guy that was running was a senior in high school. He was 18. And I got involved, and I went knocking on doors at 15 years old. And looking back, I mean, I just think about how ridiculous that must have seemed to a lot of people. But you know what? It was a great experience. I think that, people, in a way, I think it made people listen. Like, what do you mean? I got this young kid at my door. Like, what is this all about? And since then, I've just contacted different candidates that I support, and they're always happy to have any kind of help that you're willing to give. I really, that's the way I've done it throughout my life. I've just contacted individual candidates and said, I want to get involved. What can I do? And believe me, they'll want your help.
Yes, they will. Well, thank you all so much for this really awesome conversation. When we think about, as Jeff was talking about, how elections are very historic and historical in concept, that this is really a pendulum, this conversation, the purpose of this conversation, because we've had such a great output and attention towards this past election that people are scared. Things are changing, and your voice is being heard. So that's why the barriers are being created, because what we're doing is working. So that's why it is so important to keep these conversations going and inviting leaders in our community to have these conversations with you, to keep you activated. So I want to thank all of our presenters again today. Thank you all so very, very much. This is, again, our final Sage Votes event. And if you are looking for a nonpartisan group to be part of in the form of civic engagement, always feel free to reach out to Sage Votes. We are a nonpartisan group looking to make as many opportunities around the political sphere as possible. We will be sending out a survey to make sure that the quality of our events are meeting your needs. So thank you all for being here tonight. So that concludes the Sage Votes component. I'm going to bring up my email here. So the next time we'll be getting together is at 7:30 for the showcase, which is a separate link that you should have. And from 7:35 to about 8:30, we'll be doing our elevator pitches. So we're very excited about that. So on that note, thank you all, and we will see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Thank you. Sorry about my son coming in.
Oh, that was so cute. I loved it.
I was like, of course, right as I start talking. But you know what? You know what my son's role is whenever we go canvassing? He carries a bag of dog treats.
Aww.